Hello, Carolina. Just a moment.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
How are you? I'm very well, thank you.
I'm
Just
trying to
move that
set up
around a
this.
bit.
This is the first time
Brilliant.
I do an Instagram live, so I'm trying to like set up this
Work it
camera.
out.
Yeah.
Don't worry. It's basically like a normal Instagram chat, only we have people joining us. So don't be nervous. And we are recording today, just because obviously, you know, with time zones and what have you, sometimes not everybody can join us live. So it's a real pleasure to have you join the BioFutures series. I thought, you know, your work, as with a lot of the people that are joining this series, you're working across different projects. Obviously, you're a senior tutor at the Royal College of Art, but you have obviously your own design inquiries and research and so forth. And so I thought it would just be good to really kick off with a brief bio, really, that, you know, what are the primary projects you're working on right now, and just a little bit about your role as a senior tutor at the Royal College of Art.
Sure. So my yeah, as you know, well, thanks so much for having me today. As well. I'm just gonna say it's great to join the series and have the chance to talk to you about my work and the sort of work we're doing at the RCA. So my main research focuses on this intersection between, you know, living systems and design. I'm kind of looking at, you know, what is this transformation potential that living matter has across different design disciplines and practices. My main ambition is just to develop a kind of a theoretical and sort of practical framework in which the role of the human designer is kind of decentered, so that we can have a better understanding of the role of materials, tools, and sort of non-human in kind of the design process and outcomes. So again, in my research, it kind of operates into different axes. One is kind of theoretical axis, and the other one is more like a critical engagement with kind of biotechnologies and design. And I have a special focus in sort of architecture, because my main background is in architecture, and also a little bit of health. Been looking at the infrastructure of the city and also kind of environmental justice. So as you can see, it's quite kind of a broad focus, and I'm also been exploring, you know, a second axis, kind of explore these ideas of fiction, thinking about the future, you know, speculation. I'm really interested about narratives and imaginaries, and how design, you know, can also have like a kind of a wider influence in this kind of in different communities. So so this is where I've been kind of focusing at the moment. I have got a range of projects that are kind of more artistic, so doing collaborations with institutions in the Netherlands, you know, a group of scientists working with marine biology. I have been working with some of my colleagues at UCL, Richard Beckett, which you're going to be talking to him in a couple of months, I think. We did a project around the built environment, looking at sort of materials, smart materials that could incorporate some of these living systems. And also, again, around this idea of future thinking and the impact of technologies. So that is more on the side of kind of my research. And how does that link in the RCA? So, so I've been working at the RCA for, I think, roughly 4 years. I joined the RCA initially working in the School of Design. I was working the design products program over there. Well, I was leading the design futures, by the way, where we were encouraging our students to think about, again, socio-political, environmental issues, and, you know, how could design shape some of these narratives and really have like a influential and a wider impact. And more recently, last year I moved to the School of Communications. Now I'm teaching now in the program which is called Information Experience Design, where again we focus more around you know, how we perceive the world, how you know, can we start thinking about you know, non-human narratives, and the program is quite ambitious, I think. We have a different sort of pathway. We have I'm leading the experimental pathway. We have students working with sound design, and again, it's about engaging students with different sort of critical inquiries, and it's about using different design mediums, to approach some of these inquiries. And yeah, it's been really exciting to try like different projects, but I'm gonna stop there. I could just keep.
No, it's very usual in this arena to have lots of different projects going on, and although on the outside they can look quite disparate and disconnected, actually there are so many synergies. I know in my own work, and really all those people that I've collaborated with, you find that by having these different things going on, you see patterns, you see synergies, you also see the differences, and it's actually really useful, really valuable to be working across science, the arts, design, because effectively you're applying all of these different lenses, aren't you, to the same problem, and obviously with the same aims, and that we all want to mitigate the crises of the world, but there are many different tools in the box that we use when we look at this. And I wondered, often you find that people enter the general domain of working with living systems and biomaterials and biodesign more generally from many and different backgrounds. How did you get involved in this work? What drew you to it, and what were your earliest inquiries?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, this question is always complicated, right? Because there are like so many things that happen on the way. So like I said, I trained as an architect. I came to the UK really interested about computation and sort of system thinking and interaction design. I was, really excited about the power of technologies that could bring into the process of designing and fabricating architecture, really. And while I was here, I sort of start, I learned more about some of the advances in biotechnology, especially, this, what they call the new field, which we know is not that new, but synthetic biology, right? Which brought this shift between, the understanding of living systems to actually manipulating living systems. And that sort of opened up a lot of possibilities for designers and architects. What would be the implications of thinking of living systems, being able to create new materials, being able to like design, new agents, intelligent agents. So in a way, synthetic biology was applying this computational logic to living systems. It was like having these really intelligent agents that would allow you to, have like amazing possibilities. And that's what kind of caught my attention. But I have to say, I was quite cautious. I was always, questioning how much of these, because there were a lot of narratives about, oh, we're going to be growing buildings and we're going to be like creating all these amazing, materials that are going to require any human intervention. And I was like, is this really possible? Like, to me, it looked quite, far-fetched. So I started working on my PhD, and I really focuses on, okay, so what are these implications of thinking of living systems as a matter for design? What happens if we start thinking about them? How can we shape them? And I sort of took that direction. And at the beginning, it was quite naive. I was really, really applying this computational logic. I was thinking about, I don't know if you're familiar with this notion of parametrics, where you can define a series of, requirements. And if you follow those requirements, you are supposed to develop an ideal sort of design outcome. So I, using that approach, I was interested in, as an architect, you're always interested about developing form. So I was looking at this process of morphogenesis, that we talk a lot about morphogenesis, in architecture, to develop buildings and think about different structures. And I started looking at that, but more in, in biology, how those actually living systems develop form, how do they grow organs, how like a human being came to be. And using this very like reductionist approach of parametrics, I sort of got engaged with this idea, and then very quickly realized it was quite limited. And so I managed to get my hands into the lab. So I started to move some influences to start working, and then I decided to apply my kind of computational approach into a sort of physical space, so really working with bacterial patterning, looking at these beautiful colonies that you can see that can create forms like snowflakes. And I guess that's when I realized that all of this engineering rhetoric that we tend to apply to biology was quite limited. Life is not a mechanical construct, something that you can easily just shape into what your intent as a designer is. So I started exploring other concepts, thinking about what our relationships we could develop, and really exploring more a notion of ethics and care, and this is where I think my thinking shifted a little bit. But yeah, essentially this is kind of how I ended up working. But still, I feel like my main interest is we often think about living systems as intelligent agents, and I think it's more messy than that. But still, the possibilities about working with these organisms are amazing, and it's something that I still find quite exciting.
And it's as you were speaking there, it reminded me of I've noticed a theme in your papers is about the frameworks and the lenses through which we see the potentialities of biomaterials, biocomputing, biodesign, and so forth. And I think one of the things that is really central is that, and you've highlighted this, as have others, Rachel Armstrong and so on, is the fact that when we're working with inert materials, it's a very different proposition to living materials, in that it's important that we understand that our understanding of nature is subjective, that we approach it from a perspective that isn't engineering led and that is really systems led. And obviously fundamentally within systems theory, the strengths and the weaknesses of engineering approaches and the strengths and the weaknesses of systems and resilience approaches are very, very clear. And I find it surprising that in education, that's not, as it were, a sort of a fundamental tenet that is taught at the base level. Because when you when you sort of undertake a reasonably sized literature review, you becomes very much apparent to you, and you will tend to get the sort of the paradigm shift, the thinking shift that you were speaking to, from looking at things parametrically, from looking at things purely in a sort of computational form, wherein it's essentially a closed system, you're programming it to do what you want. Because obviously with living material, it has its own agency and it can surprise you. It can do everything from, there can be something that actually is the kind of the spanner in the works, the glitch in the system. It could be a minor facet of the environment that the creators of the living, as it were, but curated system have overlooked. They may have overlooked the influence of temperature or of humidity or something like that can completely change the behavior of the creature, to even obviously evolution. And I noticed that another key theme in your work is the microbial. It's the tiny, it's the unseen. And obviously, our understanding of these sort of infinitely small things has changed. I mean, we have had a sort of an almost revolution of the last several years as new technologies have enabled us to see what's happening with that which was invisible before. So, I think the themes in your work, they very much speak to me of some of the bigger themes that are in this arena, and of that real need to understand that we can't go into working with biomaterials and biodesign with the same attitude and the same expectations that we used to have working with engineering-led approaches. So I wanted to really dig in first of all. Obviously, you're working with many, many different themes at the moment, but as a researcher and as a practitioner, as a teacher, what do you find the very most compelling possibilities of the moment? What's really exciting you about the horizon before us?
Oh God, that's a big question. I guess what I feel like is one of the main things again that I've been exploring, I guess, as an educator and working with my students in sort of creative practices is about you know, as creatives, we have this ability of innovating and really like thinking outside the box in a way, and sort of challenging current, again, narratives. And I'm going to go back again to this idea of narratives and imaginaries. I think you know, if we think about you know, the political environment that we are at the moment going through, and obviously the crisis with coronavirus that we just we're still kind of you know, almost going back to this, what this new normal is. It's very much it has led us to think about that, you know, some of the current systems really don't work. You know, the way that we approach, the way we relate with the world, the way we relate with other you know, ecologies is not quite there. We need to do something about this. And I think for me at the moment it's about maybe thinking about collective futures. Is about, you know, how can we you know, approach some of these main crises, the climate crisis, the wars, and if we can reframe some of the narratives that have been imposed by, you know, by capitalism, by, you know, big corporations that keep telling us that, you know, we need to keep living the way we do, and we need to sort of constrain ourselves. And I think if we are to do, you know, to do something to sort of I don't know, tackle some of these issues, is about maybe you know, giving voice to minorities. And I think we're doing that somehow. You know, we now understand that it's not the same. The world can be very different if you're a woman or if you've been discriminated. And I feel like we need to extend that to non-human minorities as well, and really understand what would be this collective future. You know, if we were to include, for instance, you know, the animals in the city, if we were to think about, as you said, the microbiome, all of these microscopic organisms, and not to think of them just as a threat, but also like they're part of a wider ecosystem. And so I feel, for me, what is really exciting is about, you know, we have this capacity to imagine, to really, like, you know, think outside the box, is can we then imagine a different kind of future, a collective future that takes into account a lot of these things, and what do we do, you know, what kind of policies do we need to change, what kind of new like strategies that we need to develop to be able to you know, to get to that future, to like make it real. And I guess I'm quite open, you know, like there are many possibilities. And I think as an educator, you know, you learn a lot about your students. They're obviously quite aware of new things happening, and they're quite open, you know, because sometimes we're really biased. You've been thinking about this from a very specific point of view, and then they come up with like completely different new ideas. And I think that's what makes it really exciting. You know, it's like, you know, we can really imagine things in a different way. And I guess that for me is the most exciting part, is like open up the possibilities and maybe move away from, you know, our current, you know, ways of thinking.
And it strikes me, you know, at the RCA and at the Bartlett and Central St Martin's and really all of the London schools, they are global magnets for talent from multiple continents. I think it's fair to say they all have a fairly large share of international students, international staff, and that does bring this collective perspective. But actually thinking beyond that, you know, in terms of diversity, when we look at really the awful things that are happening around the world right now, we are effectively seeing a form of colonialism re-emerging. We're seeing ideas of old imperialism are coming back. They're coming back with tremendous force, wherein ideologies are being imposed, and the idea of diversity, and also, you know, is being eradicated, and also this idea that strength is best, that the best way to decide who's going to run a country or a whole region is through war, through who's got the biggest and the most weapons. Whereas obviously, you know, we know that environmentally, we know that socially, this creates crises. And it strikes me that some of the communities that if you like, have lived with these crises, not just over years or over decades, but over what is now centuries, are indigenous peoples. They're the indigenous peoples of the Americas, of Asia, and so forth. Do you see much sort of not just interest, but effort going into trying to attract students and indeed staff from indigenous communities to bring in that extra layer, that cultural richness, be it at the RCA or in the higher education arena more generally?
I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, regarding to that, to attract more, as you said, diverse, diversity into these institutions. I think it's changing. I think it's definitely changing. I think we are now hiring more people to join our department, and I think we're taking more that approach. But I think we have to be more active in actually bringing that kind of talent and people, as you said. I think we're not there yet. I think there's a lot to be done. I think although institutions are really now engaging and sort of committing to doing that, I think there's still, sometimes these big institutions that obviously have a big name, and they might be seen as something that is not something you can, it's almost like unapproachable, right? Because they have achieved a high level of standard, and I think we need to make sure that that is not a privilege. It's an opportunity, and it should be open to anyone with any kind of background. And I think, again, like I said, it is kind of changing, but I think there's a lot to be done there yet. I don't think we have achieved yet a good target to say, oh, we're actually being that inclusive. I think there's a lot, but it's good to see that. Yeah, again, I love the RCA. We have amazing colleagues, and I think they're really fighting for these to be more present, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
I mean, it strikes me, when I think to the sort of shifts we've seen at the global scale this past dozen years, a couple of the really big trends are firstly that we've seen Chinese students and from Asia more generally performing incredibly well in some of the international competitions. When I think back to sort of the early noughties to the early 2000s, it wasn't the norm that Chinese students would be getting finalist places, let alone winning, scooping up awards across multiple design categories, architecture categories, film, media, and so forth. And this past several years, there's been this really strong trend. I mean, certainly when I'm doing awards work, I find it very unusual if there aren't a number of very, very strong entries from China. And one of the things that's always very consistent in the really good entries is there's a very deep level of understanding of philosophy, of concept. You can see that culturally, the sort of ideas that we are in the global north really now reconnecting with, things like the systemic approach, the resilient approach, not engineering approach, these obviously were in effect native to that region. There are a lot of belief systems and other cultural facets of their cultures that have integrated this over time. And there hasn't been a formal study of, well, why is it that Chinese students are doing incredibly well in competitions? But it does strike me that this is not coincidental. And likewise, if you look to somewhere like Canada, Canada's had some really interesting things going on in terms of its planning, its development. And one of the reasons for that is the rising influence of the indigenous peoples, and some of the work that they've been doing is just extraordinary, because they're not just looking at remediating environmental crises, but they're doing it in a way that is simultaneously historic and integrates all of their cultural learning over millennia in with, you know, state-of-the-art technologies and ideas, and they're just splicing it up. And although, as you say, I think when I think to places like the RCA and the other top colleges, I think visually, in terms of your folios and in terms of your work, you have to have an extremely high level to get into these institutions. But although some of the sort of the, you know, when we look to the communities around the world, they may not always be able to hit those same visual levels. Certainly if we're thinking about conceptually, if we're thinking about philosophically, we're thinking about it systemically. You know, when I've spoken to audiences in Canada, to Native American peoples there, they just get it. They completely get it. I can be talking about really sophisticated concepts that sometimes communities in Europe are lost with, and they're just with it because, you know, this is how they've been working for ages. So, you know, I really do hope that we see more effort to just integrate Indigenous peoples from around the world. Because also the other key thing here is that a lot of what, again, we think to be state-of-the-art concepts, that, you know, they're old school in these traditions, pop up, temporary, you know, you name it. Biomaterials, working with only what you've got in your vicinity, recycling. You know, they've been doing this since the Bronze Age and earlier.
I completely agree. I mean, I'm originally from Mexico, right? So I come from the global south, and as you said, I mean, I feel like we still need. One of the things that I do in my job is I'm really committed to, like, you know, open up and bring some of these institutions and bring more people coming from the global south. I don't think we have enough representation there yet, which is a shame because there's a lot of, like, really talented, obviously, people. But as you said, you know, some of the things that we are often talking about in this global north, we're talking about, you know, often about bioremediation, we're talking about sustainability, and we're often talking about all these vernacular traditions that have been, you know, with, as you said, these indigenous peoples for, you know, some, like, for a long time. I mean, and these are not new. It's just that we are kind of rebranding them. We're just making them look more like cool and trendy. And I often think, like, is it? It's just, you know, it's maybe acknowledging that, you know, we're kind of going back to some of our roots in a way. But again, there's a lot about how we present these narratives, right? It's about how we construct, we kind of visualize some of these new technologies. We said, oh, no, this is completely new, when in fact it's something that, as you said, these communities have been developing for years and years, and it's completely normal for them because, you know, they are aware of the context. They are not so detached. And I think, you know, the advantages and disadvantages of living in these, you know, developed countries is that sometimes you're so detached of all of this, that, you know, you're not aware of what is already happening. And so yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think, and this is one of the things I oftenly, find, I kind of fight back when it comes to narratives on biodesign, you know, because we often position a lot of these new, practices, like completely new practices, where in fact they're actually not that new. So I think we need to be careful. And as you said, it would be great to, like, being able to bring more of these communities to really get involved and remove this notion of exclusive and, you know, high profile that we often see in the global south, in the global north. Sorry. So yeah, I agree with you completely.
And yeah, I mean, you know, we're dealing with so many challenges. A couple of the things that I've spoken about earlier in the series is the fact that, you know, I mean, for starters, we've got issues of value. We've got the fact that how, certainly since the Industrial Revolution, we've been valuing things, we've been valuing design, we've been valuing art. It is in some ways at odds with the biomaterial, and you could arguably say the sort of circular design construct more generally, in that obviously, for example, the idea when people spend a lot of money on, for sake of argument, a couture dress or a mansion, they do it usually in the expectation that this is a heritage piece. This is something that they can either sell and possibly at a higher price, or they can hand down through the generations. But obviously what we've entered now is well, it's not a completely new, it's a new old way of seeing the material world, of actually creating things with a view to their end of life, to them actually not staying around forever, and not necessarily being something that you could hand down to your child or grandchildren, but something that is only going to actually be materially have material integrity for so long as it's needed, and then it's going to enter back into the material cycle, and it's going to be turned into something else, or maybe the same thing again but with some modifications. You know, these are some of the challenges we're facing. What are some of the other big challenges that you have found as relates to working with living systems, biomaterials, biodesign in your work? What are the things that, you know, day to day can be difficult?
I think, I mean, thinking about what you said about value, I think, yeah, probably working with living systems emphasizes quite a lot of these issues that you just mentioned, because, you know, when we talk about ownership, when we talk about, yeah, value, how do you put, like, you know, when we think about ownership, when it comes to something that is actually alive, right? And that it has, I mean, for me, it's interesting that nowadays we have, you know, big corporations like, you know, the Silicon Valley, who have been dominating all of these digital technologies, now also thinking about the bioeconomy and thinking about, can we, you know, think about the human body? Can we streamline the human body? You know, can we make the human body more efficient? And they are now developing, you know, apps that monitor your, you know, your bodies, so that you don't have to worry about sleeping, or, you know, a few things, not worry about aging. And so we keep developing, you know, we keep thinking about life as something that could be extracted, that's something that could be exploited, that's something that could be sold. And for me, I think that it's very problematic. And I think living systems obviously emphasize that. And I think the other challenge as well is this the solutionist approach that we often have when it comes to, again, I think we often think about, you know, developing biodesign and all of these new products is, like you said, they're intelligent agents, and we often see them as a way of substitution or remediation. And I think we keep replicating the same models. We keep thinking about, we're going to replace plastic for mycelium, we're going to replace these. And I guess for me it is problematic, this notion of instrumentalizing, you know, biology and living system, and just thinking of them in the benefits of, for us, like humans, right? You know, how can we make them, how can we exploit them, how can we use them to our benefit, to think about products, to think about applications, to think about so I think it's moving away from that, and is thinking about strategies where, you know, can we transform this relation with not humans? Can we make a more equitable relationship, you know, where we don't need to use some of these, I think notions of sustainability and green, they have become a little bit of, you know, ticking boxes exercises. And a lot of these are also like strategies that we use for like social signaling nowadays. And I think, I guess the challenge about working with living systems is sort of recognizing those limitations, and maybe thinking about how we relate to them, and you know, what kind of other practices can we develop. We really need to rethink about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's about challenging some of these narratives again, to open up possibilities, you know, to thinking about, you know, what could emerge out of these new dynamics. And yeah, I don't know, it's again, I know I talk a lot about frameworks, but I think for me that's the main thing, you know, to think about new possibilities, more collective, inclusive ways of thinking when it comes to like and I think that applies to materials as well. We keep thinking about materials, as you said, as even though people keep saying, okay, we're now thinking about life cycles, we're now thinking about being more conscious. You know, if we think about when you think about the process of developing some of these materials, and they call something about technological readiness, right? A lot of now designers engage with this material world, and they start doing all of these testings, and they hit a wall at some point when they realize this is something that is not scalable. This is something that is not going to be able to reach the market as easily as other products. Why? Because my new product only is going to be feasible for a few days, a few months, and then it's going to disintegrate, and it's going to get moldy, and it's going to smell. And I often, this is something I often have to discuss with my students, like, okay, so does it mean that you discard completely that material and you realize this is not feasible? Or is it because we need to rethink, you know, our systems of production? We need to rethink about our economies. We need to rethink about temporalities. You know, we need to think about, like, nothing is going to be permanent. And there is a process of transformation, as you mentioned. But I think it's about, again, it's about breaking a lot of these narratives, frameworks, and really like allow some of these things to actually exist, you know. Yeah. And I think those are the challenges. I think that for me was part of what I explored from moving from architecture to product design to, you know, moving across these different scales, is, you know, how do we go beyond that wall that, you know, we face, and all of a sudden says, oh, you cannot go beyond that because there's so many challenges there that you won't be able to reach that point that you want to achieve.
I think in one of your papers, you coined you had an inquiry that I thought was really critical. You were looking at eugenics within the big technology companies of Silicon Valley. And I thought that as far as, you know, this particular field is concerned, that term eugenics is absolutely critical, because what we're seeing at the moment through synthetic biology and genetic engineering is effectively choices being made about the evolution of particular species that are being curated in a way that serves these extracted ideals, these very particular tasks, that when that process is underway, it is obviously being done with only some of the knowledge. It's partial knowledge, in that we have obviously recently realized that what had been thought of as junk DNA actually serves a purpose. Effectively, I mean, I sometimes wonder if, you know, within and of the DNA there is an RNA, you know, there is this, as it were, sort of spare stuff that's knocking around in case you need to switch up the evolutionary process and you need to bring in these, you know, these new features. And so, you know, we're generally sort of starting to think about what is actually an incredibly new area of human discovery, genetics, in different ways. And yet there is this engineering approach being taken to life. And it's not just obviously being taken at the level of the genetics, at the level of the DNA, but actually more generally in terms of curation of life in cities. So for example, you know, one of the big critiques obviously recently has been the fact that honeybees are not an endangered species. Lots of other bee species are endangered. And yet when you introduce a lot of honeybees, obviously they are competing for the pollen and they can actually disrupt these other species. And yet we're still seeing, and I very much think of them as box ticking exercises of the kind you were just speaking to. You know, we see corporates sort of showing off because they've stuck honeybees on their roofs, you know, and it's kind of, oh, you know, we're green, we're saving the world. And it's, well, I don't think so, you know, not unless, you know, you've introduced a particular species that needs to be, you know, increased in numbers in order to protect it. And, you know, and unless you haven't got a means to, as it were, you know, get honey and other bee related products through a sustainable supply chain, you know. But there is this curation of life, and it strikes me as being incredibly dangerous. So, you know, within the course of your narratives at, you know, at the Royal College of Art and your other conversations, obviously, you know, I've seen you've been at a number of institutions, including Newcastle. Yes. Newcastle. Yeah. You with Rachel Armstrong, you were on the experimental architecture team.
Yeah, Rachel was one of my examiners when I was finishing my PhD, and I got the chance to work with her when she was a professor of experimental architecture over there and developing her group. So we got the chance to work together for a bit.
I thought I clocked that on CV. You know, in the course of your experience in higher education, you know, how many conversations have you heard around this idea of, you've used the term eugenics, but you know, the curation of life, and what the sort of unintended consequences of that might be?
Wow, I mean, I think that is something that again, it's we have these and again, advances of biotechnologies, you know, whether it's synthetic biology or, like you said, genetic engineering and so on, they have these, I don't know, one of the problems with science is quite reductionist sometimes, right? And it's all about, you know, one of the things that synthetic biology was claiming is that we're going to be moving away from the messiness of traditional biology, and we're going to just, you know, make it more streamlined and you know, efficient. And we have this notion of everything has to be more efficient, and everything has to be more, you know, yeah, and I don't know. We have these ideals of how life should be, and we also have this romantic idea of nature. You know, nature is perfect. Nature is something that you know, when we often talk about the climate crisis, I think there's still this misunderstanding that if we leave just nature without being touched, then it's going to regenerate and completely come back. And the truth is that, you know, nature changes, and it's never going to be able to really fully come back to what it was. So I think this is one of the, you know, as you said, there are a lot of conversation about this, a lot of them coming from, you know, like I said, I think a lot of advances in biotechnologies try to, and I can understand this, you know, there's this need to, you know, we're developing new drugs and so on, so we need to make things more efficient. But I think in that discourse, it becomes quite problematic because, as you said, a lot of this is about curating which species are allowed to survive and which species are not allowed to survive. I was reading the other day, I mean, one of my students was looking at squirrels, and when Brexit happened, there was a lot of on the news about these gray squirrels that are supposed to be like not natives from the UK, right? They come from abroad, and they're considered like an invasive species, because then the native species are like these beautiful red squirrels with pointed ears, and so there were a lot of discourses about controlling and giving contraceptives to the squirrels and not allow them to reproduce. And it was quite silly, but it is like, you know, we often control a lot of these species, and it's not just, you know, not just animals. You know, we have species of microbes which are, we see them as, you know, they're cultivated and they're grown and basically controlled to produce drugs and to produce a specific, you know, applications. So we are basically exploiting them all the time. So we as humans, again, we have this obsession with control, and which I think, again, is very problematic. And this is something that, again, as designers, we often, you know, architects, we're control freaks, right? We define every single line in the blueprint of how things are supposed to be. And then when things don't go according to the plan, we just completely became like, you know, I don't know, it is crazy because we cannot cope with that, you know, with losing that control. And I think, we often, I think we still have a lot of these narratives that we need to control. We need to like select which species are allowed to thrive and allowed to grow and allowed to survive, which ones are not. And again, and that extends to the human body, that extends to, you know, race, and that extends to, like you said, communities. And I think this is where, you know, we need to question how much technology is a tool, but also could be a weapon. You know, it could be the opposite. It could actually make more harm that actually help. So yeah, I think these are conversations we often have. you know, I often have this with my students. You know, I know we can get really, they can get really excited about, you know, a new thing that is coming up. You know, they saw like this new application that just Facebook released that, you know, you don't need to worry about the number of calories because you test your DNA and it's going to tell you exactly how much you need to take. And they're just like, wouldn't it be amazing? Yeah, I don't need to worry about like what, you know, it's going to tell me exactly what I need to buy. And it's like, okay, to what extent this is actually, you know, a good thing, right? You don't even have that choice anymore. You know, you've been told what you need to eat every single day. And yeah, it is kind of it is fascinating to see how you know, people can get really excited about these things. And I think it's also probably you know, a lack of understanding. We need you know, yeah, I think we need to people need to be more aware of some of these implications, and I think this is why we need to have these conversations, right? We need to discuss about you know, what it is to what extent this is something positive. So yeah, I mean, the thing with the squirrels was fascinating. There were like so many strategies just to stop them. You know, I think one of them was even encouraging people to kill them, and then there were like recipes by different chefs of how to cook the squirrels.
Lifestyle angle.
And I know it sounds funny, but it's just like, you know, can we actually control that? You know, like to what extent we have this role of gods of, you know, this,
I suppose, you know, the other thing, another key thing on invasive species, I mean, there are some invasive species which are genuinely a real problem. You know, if I were to think of what I think will probably be the most problematic invasive species to Britain, it would be Asian hornets. Asian hornets arrived in a cargo from Asia to, I think it was Bordeaux, literally just several years ago. They've now spread out. They've colonized all of France. They've colonized surrounding countries. They've colonized the south of England. And Asian hornets, I mean, a lot of people aren't familiar with how lethal these are. You know, literally 5 Asian hornet stings can kill a grown man. If that person has been drinking, they can be more lethal. They have no natural predator in the United Kingdom or Europe. And they colonize at a rate of about a nest every 3 kilometers. You know, they are a real problem. And yet hardly anyone is talking about Asian hornets and thinking about this a genuine problem, a threat to life, human and non-human, and yet they're sort of worried about grey squirrels, which is, I think, in Britain quite ironic, because obviously the entire British ecology is in effect a garden, because of course people have been, you know, changing the British landscape at scale for at least 10,000 years. And it's, you know, in many ways it's ecologically impoverished. And they're worrying about grey squirrels. But it speaks to this problem that I think is very common, and I think is interesting as far as microbes go, because you mentioned that, you know, a lot of people think of nature as being beautiful, and we've all seen the bullet points. It's collaborative, not competitive, you know, it's this, that and the other. I mean, nature can be extraordinary, but certainly I think anyone that's really studied nature in any details knows it can be absolutely gross. It can be, yes, I mean, particularly microbes, when you look at what some microbes do to it, you know, for us it's not attractive, but it is. I guess the challenge for us, and the challenge with microbes, is the fact that sometimes even the very most disgusting facets of nature actually serve an incredibly important process. You know, I personally hate mosquitoes. I hate blue bottles. I hate flies. But I accept the fact, wipe them all out, and that's the food source of umpteen species gone. Yep. It's you know, it's no more. And so it is, you know, it's a process of accepting processes, and of actually realizing that nature is not ornamentation. So yeah, a big sort of paradigmatic shift there. And just sort of building on that, you know, so I mean, nature is a highly subjective construct, and really sort of understanding that is something that I think it's fair to say is kind of pivotal in the direction that a student will take in the course of their studies. What sort of techniques do you use, or what sort of techniques do you think can be useful in trying to prevent against bias in students and potentially, you know, in society more general? What things do you find useful?
Well, one of the things that I've been working with my students is exploring this notion of situated knowledge. So contextualizing, acknowledging where do you come from, you know, what is your cultural background and how does that influence your thinking? You know, we often have students coming and they are designing these projects, and I have these workshop with them about, okay, so if you were to design the same chair back in India, do you think people is going to be interested? And it's like, well, I don't think they will understand what I was trying to do. Why not? Because the context is completely different. So I think one of the strategies that I use with my student is helping them to contextualize, to understand that every decision that they take is going to have an implication, and we all have biases. Nothing is black and white. Nothing is going to be always positive. I know, you know, we designers, I think we have this notion of the hero. We're going to save the world, and design is always going to be positive. But I think it's always asking my students to be quite reflective, thinking, constantly questioning, you know, why am I doing this? Why is this relevant? And how the context in which I'm designing this or thinking about this is influencing my decisions. And also where, you know, I mean, I'm, you know, coming from Mexico, like, you know, my cultural background, you know, the knowledge that I acquired as a kid, everything has, you know, it's going to have an impact in the way that I think and approach things. So I think is letting them know that nothing is, you know, it's about reflecting about the impact of the decision. It's about contextualizing all of their thinking. It's about, and I think the other strategy as well that I have been using, which has been really interesting, is about bringing emotion and asking my students to a lot of the, you know, sometimes when we're thinking about you know, thinking about a new proposal and so on, we often see these completely detached, like I'm not in there, like I'm seeing this from outside. So one of the strategies I've been using with my students is about exploring emotion. It's about exploring you know, how we relate with other things. So we did a workshop about writing love letters to non-humans. And it's about, like, you know, love can be, you know, very complicated, you know, and love letters, you know, can be, again, love can be reciprocated or cannot be reciprocated. So it was, and the intention was really the students to situate themselves into that context and really think about, how do I feel about this? How does that is affecting me as well? So I guess is, you know, some of these strategies about, you know, asking students to position themselves, situating, knowing that, you know, nothing, there's always going to be a bias. And the only way to maybe overcome some of those biases is by, you know, learning more about the context in which you are interacting, is knowing about all other agents, is about, you know, also acknowledging that, you know, you're going to be affected by this, and what other networks are going to be affected with whatever it is that you are creating. I guess that's, for me, it's been one of the strategies, and again, constantly being reflective, you know, and not being over positive. I mean, I'm it's not that I want to be, like, you know, pessimist, but I think we need to be quite critical. So yeah, I guess those are sort of the main strategies that I use with my students. And we also often use role models, you know, like thinking about thinking from a non-human perspective, how does that look like, and taking them out of the comfort zone a little bit. So yeah, I guess I've been trying some of these strategies and see how they can, help us to overcome some of these biases.
It reminds me actually, as you were speaking there, about the performing arts and the fact that actors and really performers more generally are used to putting themselves in an alien context, actually having to think about the emotions of another person, how their sense of being came to be. And it strikes me that there could be some interesting crossover there in terms of learning methodologies, how, I mean, I'm personally appalling at acting. It's one of the things for which I have absolutely no talent. And as you were speaking there, I remember one of my first drama classes when I was a child, the teacher said to me, she said to the class, pretend to be a chocolate, any kind of chocolate in a box. And as the other students were all turning themselves into raspberry creams or praline chocolates or whatever, I was sort of sat there really struggling with how to be a chocolate. It wasn't something that came naturally to me, but it did strike me that to actually put yourself in the role of that other species. I know there are some networks. In fact, I was thinking actually Heather Barnett at Central St Martin, she's done some work like this, hasn't she? With, in fact, there was an exercise she did where I remember we all had to be a slime mold, and she gave us some parameters. She effectively programmed her human sort of study, and we all did what she said. But yeah, it strikes me as that is really interesting, and I'm really glad to see that you're integrating that, because it is taking individuals out of their comfort zone, isn't it? And it's really kind of pushing their parameters. And if they can't actually, if they are kind of me struggling to be a chocolate, if they can't sort of deal with it, then it sort of emphasizes the need to try some other techniques and to actually really just find a way to become the alien, to become something that is not familiar to you and well outside your comfort zone. So no, that's really, really good to hear. And the other thing I was thinking, we were actually, you might have noticed, we were meant to have another Carolina today
Yes.
from Argentina. Sadly, Carolina had some family issues, so she couldn't make it today. But one of the reasons that I had invited Carolina is that because she's done some very interesting online workshops where she's been teaching biomaterials and elements of biodesign through courses that effectively she's curated herself. And it struck me, within education, we've seen, not just within biodesign, but more generally, we've seen this whole area really sort of opening up. We've seen, first of all, the MOOCs, the online courses. They caused a lot of disruption. Then, of course, we've had the fact around sort of geopolitics. We've had the fact that whereas the world was becoming more open and it was becoming easier for students to study across Europe or across anywhere in the world, now for various geopolitical reasons, not just within higher education, but within research, where again, we're seeing this fracturing, we're seeing these problems, obviously relating to the war in Ukraine, among other things, wherein, questions around, should we be integrating academics? Should we be having, sort of cross-political divide conversations and so on? And it's become this very, very dynamic space where technologically, conceptually, a lot is going on. And there are a lot of, I've heard, in fact, one of the most ridiculous things I heard from Silicon Valley recently, you might have seen this, were some tech bros, I think they even called themselves that actually said, the university is dead. It's dead.
God.
That there are people sort of, if you like, trying to sort of challenge the kind of the idea of higher education full stop, in a sense. Of all the things that are going on, of all these, sort of developments, what do you think really are the most important things? What do you think are the key things that are shaping higher education now? And what can you see really influencing this coming 2 decades?
Oh, well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, with all of these shifting to online teaching that was triggered by the pandemic and, having to spend hours and hours teaching over Zoom, apart from being exhausting, because it was exhausting after a full day on the screen, it was exhausting. I think, I guess, I would say there were a lot of challenges, as you said, some of them about you know, not being able to have a close contact with your students, not being able for them to immerse themselves in what was happening. So there was this detachment, right? About, you know, they're not able to fully engage or experience. We had a lot of students that obviously, you know, coming from Asia that couldn't come, and one of the things that we realized is that because they had this lack of context, they haven't been able to come and experience and see what other people were working on. The propositions were quite limited. They weren't being able to fully break from, you know, their current thinking and sort of explore new ideas. But on the other hand, we were also able to reach out and also make it more accessible, because, you know, I think one of, you know, the things that we struggle quite a lot in the UK in academia is, you know, I think there's still this thinking that, you know, students need to come with a perfect English and they should understand, and we have, you know, this high level of education and that you just fully embrace it. And to some extent that is good, but to other extent we also need, as you said, be more inclusive and understand that there are others ways of thinking, you know, like, you know, my Asian students really struggle to understand what plagiarism is, because in the context, copying and replicating is something that is quite positive. So we tend to be quite harsh, but we need to make a stronger effort to, you know, unpack some of these cultural differences. And so one of the positive things about, I think, online teaching was that, you know, students were able to revisit a lecture, were able to, you know, have subtitles. So some of them were able to, like, and I think that's something, you know, also I could observe with my students. They were able to absorb more than before because they were able to spend more time, you know, to listening to some of the concepts that we're throwing at them, and some of them can be quite complicated. So I think, you know, I think we're gonna be probably reaching some kind of blended mode where, and then again, we were also able to reach out, you know, more people. We were able to engage. I was coordinating a series of talks, so we invited people from all over the world. We were able to participate, you know, in a workshop with a person from University of Pennsylvania, having this live workshop on you know, we were working with biomaterials. So I think, you know, probably we're going to be reaching some kind in the middle, some kind of blended where, you know, now I think we're more, people is getting more aware of, you know, like you said, we're, you know, that there's some politics, and also like, we need to be more accessible when it comes to like educating and reaching out. And so I think in that sense, having this virtual presence is something that could be quite positive. But I also feel like, you know, having the ability to have like a real engagement is something that we actually need. And, you know, I think there's this wrong notion that, you know, if everything is virtual, everything is digital, then it's the same. You just watch this, it's the new Netflix, you just tune in and being able to see another like tutorial or, but the truth is, you know, like it's a completely different experience to have there and have the knowledge and actually being able to like be part of a community, be part of, you know, share that sort of common thinking in maybe that moment in which you're experiencing that kind of learning. That has a huge, it makes a huge difference, really. So I don't think we're gonna fully, you know, move away and say everything's gonna be digital. I don't think that's gonna, you know, there's always these narratives that, oh, technology is gonna completely change. I don't really think that's gonna be the case. But I also don't think, so I don't think going to the extremes is a good thing. But I also not, again, a lot of my colleagues might hate me for saying this because a lot of them were like completely against, you know, all of this online teaching. But I think there are some positive things about having that presence. And again, me coming from the global south, I was able to engage with, you know, some of the communities over there that might not be able to afford, you know, coming to the UK for a 2-day workshop, but they still can benefit from, you know, having the expertise, and I also benefit from having conversations with them. So I think, again, it's something there in between, and I think now in the RCA, we're kind of exploring a lot of these now, you know, new pedagogies and how we can make use of them, and sort of, you know, again, to be more inclusive, to connect with other communities, and you know, without losing, you know, part of that, you know, the big advantages of being sitting all in the same room at the same time. So I guess that's what I'm seeing, and we'll see what you know, other kind of methodologies we can develop.
As you were speaking there, you know, one of the key words, sorry, I'm just plugging my phone in. One of the key terms that I felt is really important is blended, because one of the things I've noticed as a keynote speaker, I've been doing keynotes, talks and lectures for probably about 20 years now. And one of the things that has really influenced it is the progression of technology. And so, for example, you know, in days of old, when you were going out to another country and you were giving a talk to a principally foreign audience that weren't native English speakers, normally what you would have is a translator, and I would have a little headpiece and I would hear the translator. And it used to be funny because sometimes if the translator, I remember there was one that sounded like a Bond villain, and so as I was giving this keynote, I was trying not to laugh because he actually sounded like the character of, I think it was Boris in not GoldenEye, but it was one of the Pierce Brosnan Bond films, and I was literally trying not to laugh. But it was quite sort of, it wasn't analog in that, you know, we had the headpiece, but it was fairly low tech, whereas obviously today, you know, we've got the technology to have a headpiece in and get real-time language translation, and, you know, you can kind of flip up on the app, which language is it? And it strikes me, you know, that is something that you could quite easily introduce into higher education lectures, because obviously, and obviously it depends on the sort of subject, but if, let's say, it was a science lecture, yes, arguably English still is the principal language of the sciences. But if it was a lecture for design or for architecture or for the STEAM genres, then, you know, it doesn't really matter if you kind of reach a level of, you know, Shakespearean English or not. You know, you can actually, the key thing is that, you know, you really understand what's being said in the lectures, and that can translate into your work, which might, you know, it might very well be a physical incarnation and not an academic paper. So, you know, I can completely relate to what you're saying about blended, and it strikes me that when thinking about, you know, some of the major developments in technologies, things like sort of augmented reality, that could be, and sort of mixed realities, really useful educational tools. And kind of relating back to the pandemic, one of the big shifts I noticed during the pandemic was that during the crits, I sit on a number of crit panels, and of course we couldn't physically gather, so we were having to integrate, well, first of all it was on Zoom, but then we were integrating VR headsets and various other bits and pieces. And although it was incredibly restrictive in terms of the fact that obviously it's very difficult to assess an architectural model or some other physical design piece,
but a demo or a prototype, yes.
The advantage was that, you know, we had, our panels were from a much broader geographic, because as you were saying, we could be zooming in folks from the West Coast, or, you know, from not so much Asia because the time difference, but, you know, we were able to become more internationalized. We were able to interrogate the students' work in different ways. Obviously, for those that were very, sometimes I notice with master's students, they're very nervous about giving a presentation about public speaking. And so for some of them, it was actually easier to speak to a screen than 5 quite potentially imposing judges that make you feel like you're on Dragon's Den. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredibly interesting space, and you know, what I'm hoping that we'll see are a number of workshops where essentially, you know, and opportunities really, and this facilitated at the level of government organizations and so on, because there are so many options. And some of the most interesting are the subtler concepts. They're, you know, we're not completely changing what we're doing. We're just layering in these new things. You know, just trying a more experimental approach to teaching. I mean, it does seem to be exciting. Now we're nearly out of time. We have, because there are so many really interesting people on this series, you are one of them, so we've got to have another conversation because we have no way covered all the things that we need to. But there are two questions that every single person in this series and in all the series is going to be asked, and the reason is because your answer is going to be compiled. I'm going to be putting together articles, reports, and so forth. So your first question is, thinking beyond higher education, thinking to the whole world. The year is 2050. What does the biomaterialized world look and feel like?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I've been thinking about, like I said, part of my research deals with the idea of futures. And I'm really interested in what is the significance of thinking about the future and what are the cultural implications of speculating about the future. And one of the things that I have been writing about is how much we are culturally biased of thinking of the future as something which is already set, you know, as a fate, something that can be predicted or divine. So I think what is important when we talk about the future is to think about different scenarios, you know, events that could take place depending on different trajectories that might, you know, that the present might take. So I'm gonna respond to your question, maybe thinking about two different scenarios. So I think we can start thinking about 2050, which is more lively, you know, given the, you know, our present. But I would, you know, in terms of the, you know, the materialized world, I think it could be, 2050 could be very similar to 2022. We will have more maybe technologies with a bio component, you know, at their core, but it will feel more familiar because, you know, most of these new technologies will be a substitute of current technologies and processes that we already have. And I think this, again, because we have this trend that we have seen in the last few years, which is about this umbrella of substitution and remediation. And I think that could be a trap where, you know, we cannot really look beyond the you know, the affordances of our current technologies and developments. So we keep thinking under the same models and emulating the same dynamics. So I think one scenario could look really similar, but maybe having that bio component. I think the other scenario that I can see in 2050, and this is the one that I would like to see, is the one that has a more fundamental change, you know, in the way that we approach our production of food, the way we build our cities, the way we create our clothes, and to see, you know, the experience of working alongside other, like, non-humans has transformed these areas completely, you know, to the point that we no longer need to think about green and sustainable, like I said, as strategies, because this relationship with non-human is something that is more equitable, and it's no longer a ticking box exercise, you know, that, like I said, quite often is. So I guess that's how I would like to see the 2050, you know, having, again, a different kind of dynamic where we are thinking more collectively and less, you know, and moving away from these, you know, notions of control and exploitation. So I guess that's how I see it.
So hopefully a more equitable, more connected, and obviously a lot less wasteful world, with any luck.
With any luck.
Yeah, with any luck, or probably actually a lot of luck, given the general state of the world right now. So your final question. You've got one wish. If a genie popped out of a magical lamp or a test tube in your lab and granted you just one wish for the biofuture, it could be for you, it could be for the world, whichever, what would it be?
Well, 100 wishes, right?
100, yeah.
No, I mean, I think what I will ask is to grant humanity, you know, at large, you know, the ability to reframe our narratives again, that we can become more capable of telling the stories of who we are and how we have gotten here, by again considering the collectives that are involved. You know, again, thinking about the main issues that we discussed today. I think most of these issues around climate change and wars and everything is very much told from the human at its, you know, thinking about humans at its core. It is always about powerful characters, often white men, taking decisions and forcing others. And like I said, we are now seeing a little bit of change of those narratives in the last few years. So my wish would be that this process, again, it's extended to non-human minorities as well, and you know that we use our imagination to understand the way that, you know, to think about this collective future. You know, and I guess part of changing this narrative is also, I guess, would be to grant humanity a little bit more of humility, and maybe acknowledging that we don't fully understand the world around us. I think that's something that coronavirus, if we learn to something about coronavirus again, is being more humble about our context. And so I guess that would be my wish, really. Again, it's like, you know, reframing our narratives, including again other minorities, and like I said, thinking about a collective future and be more humble. I think we need to be more and more humble. I think we really need that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess reframing what success looks like, because the last 20 years, success, so say, has been your face on the cover of Time magazine and a lot of money in the bank. And then actually, you know, that if everybody is trying for that, then the world's going to, you know, end up in a pretty bad place, isn't it? So thank you so much for spending the time today, Carolina. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you. Your work is incredibly interesting. So I'll share a link to your bio in the DMs, not in the DMs, in the comments. And I would recommend to everyone that's tuned in to look up some of your papers. The Eugenics in Big Tech is really interesting, but your paper, as we mentioned, Richard Beckett is going to be joining us in the middle of May. And you obviously co-authored a paper on microbial communities in the built environment. So we'll be extending, we'll be having a conversation around that. Maybe we could even dial you in. You could be,
oh, it would be amazing.
in mid-flow with Richard. Yeah, and I will be compiling your insights for this, but we've only just touched the surface today, haven't we? So I hope that we get a chance to revisit this conversation, and I'm also hoping to visit the RCA very soon, because you always have so many exciting projects going on there.
Please let me know. I will be more than happy to, like, you know, bring you into the program and show you some of the things that we're working on.
Some of the work going.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's been amazing. It's always nice to have this conversation. So absolutely, I hope we can carry on talking about this.
Excellent.
In the future.
Well, take care, and I will be in touch soon. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. I'll actually give you a little sneak peek. So next week's session is with Andrew Grant of Grant Associates, who are the company behind the iconic Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. They have worked on many incredible projects. So Andrew will be joining us Thursday. We'll be starting half an hour earlier for that session. So I hope to see you all then. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye, Carolina.
Bye-bye.